Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyday life as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week, there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. Today's guest, Dr. Alessandra Pino, is an expert on the intersections of a Gothic food and cultural memory. Alessandra is the co-author of A Gothic Cookbook coming in autumn 24, which digs into food themes and motifs in a series of classic and contemporary novels from the 19th century to the present day. And she's a co-host of Fear Feasts podcast, which analyzes the horror genre films and books through the lens of food. So that's definitely a podcast you guys should be looking into. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Ali. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Gabriela. It's lovely to see you.
So let's start with the kind of food historian sort of profession, because it sounds self-explanatory, but there's many different sort of niche specialisms within it, and yours seems to have a particularly literary bent. So can you tell us about what it is you do, and what your specialism in it is?
Yes, I worked for nearly 10 years in a Michelin-starred restaurant, and I was able to see their food, the enjoyment of food and how food was worked with live, from the suppliers to people's plates. And I loved that aspect of it. And the chef I was working for also did a lot of TV and exhibitions because of his knowledge of food. So I was in close contact with the history of food from that perspective from quite an early age. And then I started getting more and more interested in the history of food and the mystery of food, I would say, because there's a lot that we don't know about food. Not everything is preserved in the way that other things might be preserved through time when it comes to food. So it's sort of guessing. And I did a PhD in food and cultural memory. And my passion is to kind of look at the darker side of food. So that's how it all started out. And I finished my PhD. And actually, while I was doing my PhD, I already had started writing a Gothic cookbook with my co-author, Ella Buchan. And we were collaborating on the fact that food is not really what it seems when it comes to Gothic literature in particular. Sometimes people don't even see the food in some of the novels. But for me, it was really important to notice that the food had its own trajectory and it was sending us some very special and mysterious signals throughout the novels.
Definitely, yes. I mean, you make a very good case for it in your book for sure. And I was wondering about, like, can you elaborate a little bit on what you said about like the darker side of food? Because like what do you mean by that? Do you just mean scarcity, or do you mean something different?
That's a good question, actually. It is scarcity, but it's not just scarcity, because actually the darker side of food, yes, it manifests itself in the sites of production. For example, my PhD was on sugar plantations in Cuba. So, the harrowing and violent lives of the people who work to create a market for the Western world to enjoy birthday cakes, for example. And in that sense, that connection is very dark to me, because we are using a product in a way that allows us to enjoy a certain lifestyle, but we are ignoring the production and the modalities of production, which are not so enjoyable for the people who are doing it. And I think that's manifested itself throughout the ages, from colonialism onwards, and exportation of products and mass consumption. And it is, something interesting to me to do with sugar, but also other products such as rum, such as even the production of tea, things that have led to certain.
I'm sorry, can you hold? Sorry, sorry to interrupt you. There's something. The video froze.
Oh,
and I don't know if it froze on your end. Definitely. Okay.
No, I could see you. Yeah, I could see you
Okay.
perfectly.
All
And
right.
are you able to edit? Yeah.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, I can edit. I can
Oh,
edit,
that's
no
good.
problem. But yeah, just okay. It's come back to normal now. I
Yeah.
think it just
Okay.
yeah. So can we go back to sugar
Yeah, sure.
plantation? Sorry, yeah.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right.
So, yes, the darker side of food always interested me because I feel that, yes, the darkness resides in obviously those places. And my PhD was on the sugar plantations in Cuba. So it resides in those places where there is a type of labor which is obviously connected to slavery, to violence, to oppression, to exploitation. And on the other side of that, with the exportation of those products, there is the Western world, the Western side of the world, enjoying the final product of that, cakes, etc. And we see this a lot in literary terms, also in cinema, where there is some unease around the consumption of certain products, especially sugar, where there's a kind of signal of danger. And that started to interest me, and I started observing that there was a kind of separation between those sites of production and then how food was being used in other parts of the world, and it was creating a sense of tension and horror. And so we see this especially in Gothic literature and in horror films, for example, the use of sweet things that we would correlate normally to childhood, to joy, to having fun, to celebration because you have birthday cakes, etc. But actually, you see this association more and more, an association to horrific incidents when it comes to the use of sugar.
Do you think that's a modern interpretation, or do you think that in contemporary terms, in sort of Gothic literature, there was a sense of awareness of, where the sugar products come from, for example, or maybe was it like more connected to the sort of religious aspect and the kind of Protestant lifestyle and Protestant sort of value system?
I think that, the idea of sugar changed quite a lot. There wasn't the honey was being used before to the colonial expansion, that we get more sugar and that it's more readily available. And so I think that has a big impact on how it is used. The first Gothic novels didn't really have any mention of food or sweets or anything like that. We get to The Woman in White, for example, and evil characters are being associated to being gluttonous, to sugar, to tarts, fruity tarts, and to things which are bonbons, to chocolate. So there is a change there that occurs for sure during the Industrial Revolution, in that period of time there where things were very much changing in the food world.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think when we're talking about kind of history of food and, in terms of its localized context and the kind of wider context as well. I was thinking, so the selection of novels, for obvious reason, because of the kind of movement in Gothic literature, were very Anglo-centric. But I noticed when I was looking you up that your background is Venezuelan, Italian, and you were raised in Britain. So do you feel like you have another sort of cultural insight that lets you sort of see it from a slightly different perspective as well?
Yes, I do think so. I think that, and I lived in Venezuela as well, where there is a different attitude to sugar. I remember being a teenager and they weren't bakeries like there are in Europe, that's for sure. There's just a different approach to the whole idea of sugar. And I do remember my father saying to me, because I was living in London, and I remember one of my babysitters used to put so many spoonfuls of sugar in her tea. And I started getting to an age where I wanted to try tea, and I said, I'm going to put some sugar in my tea. And my father said, don't you dare. We don't do that kind of thing. And I started understanding
Don't
that
you
for him,
start with this European nonsense here.
right. And I didn't understand what he meant by that initially, because I did feel that I was from London, but also I had this other side, which was completely different, and this different cultural perspective, where it was absolutely obscene to do something like that, and quite disrespectful. And I didn't understand to who or why, but it was something that obviously he very firmly instilled in me. And then living in different countries where they're less Western, definitely I saw a massive difference. I call it difference, and I mean, only more recently, I think in the last 10 years, we have this very, very direct link between sugar and danger. But before, it was, still something that we had perhaps in moderation. Now sugar is being put in everything, even goods where you wouldn't expect there to be sugar. There is sugar.
I mean, in Americas especially, there's like in Northern America, there's been a lot recently in media about just how bad, especially food from the USA is, in terms of just how highly processed, and how corn syrup, and corn derived glucose syrup is just basically, added to every single food.
Everything.
And yeah, it's quite shocking actually, because there's been loads of shows about it, and there's lots of like health shows that are shown, or kind of like health awareness shows, like on Netflix, and they're always very American centric, because I suppose that is the biggest audience.
And it's the Americans who produce them, and it's the Americans.
And it's shocking from a European sort of point of view to see what Americans eat. It is just, I don't think there's another word for it aside from shocking. I was watching one of those programs with my daughter, and she was just like, "Mummy, is this like, do they really eat that?"
And I think the most shocking thing about anything which is introduced into food legally and without fully the awareness of the consumer, okay, because sometimes we really don't know, and unless you're there looking at the back of the package and checking the label, and even then it can be quite difficult to decipher what all those different types of sugar actually mean. The stabilizers, the emulsifiers, the fructose, the sucrose, there's a terminology. The fact that some things are written light, but L-I-T-E and not L-I-G-H-T, these two different lights mean completely different things. But if you're reading it on a yogurt, you might think, oh, this is healthy, because you wouldn't expect it not to be. So there is kind of there is something quite secretive, and it feels like it's dangerous. And I think
it's definitely intentional. Like, obviously it's definitely intentional in countries like America, where mega food corporations have huge amount of influence.
Yes.
They can pretty much do whatever they want. Like, there's now apparently no legal obligation to be truthful and consistent in your labeling. Like, you don't actually have to tell them what is inside the food. People, so you can provide untrue information basically on labels.
Well, yes, it's very scary.
And yeah, which is still something that in Europe is not permitted in any European Union countries, for sure.
And I think that also the fact that, if depending on what your financial resources are looking like, it's not like you can afford, there are more sugar product, more organic products, but I mean the price difference, especially now that we've come out of Brexit, with the situation of inflation that's here in the UK at the moment, for instance, you're looking at 4 or 5 times the price of
absolutely
a non-organic product, or cheaper product, which means less healthy. So that's also something to keep in mind. And we are bombarded while all this is happening. We are bombarded with messaging which tells us sugar is bad, don't do this, exercise more, and the sugar is being introduced, as well as other very harmful things such as rapeseed oil, different oils, which are harmful.
I mean, it's definitely pushing the narrative, when we talk about storytelling, and we're
Mm,
talking about, storytelling and food and food
mm,
production. I think
yes.
it's definitely trying to push the narrative of individual responsibility when it comes to food. And I think the moment you kind of scratch the surface of food production processes and legislation, all that, it becomes very apparent that personal responsibility has very little to do with the outcomes.
And yet we're feeling the weight of
Yeah,
it, aren't we? And I think this really comes through in the storytelling, in the storytelling, both in films and in books, that we are feeling this massive weight on our shoulders where we need to lower our carbon footprint. And yet there are foods flying around the world which are coming from all over the place. Or if
absolutely.
you're wealthy enough, you're not worrying about your carbon footprint really.
Mm,
But it's this pressure being pushed on people that really don't have the means to
yeah,
buy foods which are perhaps healthier and would be better.
absolutely. I
This
think
is,
visually as well, like it's so reinforced in movies and TV shows, perhaps less so now than in the early noughties, but you would still see images of people who are overweight, and it's like, oh, we're just gluttonous. It's like a
mm, mm,
personal
mm.
kind of fault. And now there's this sort of Netflix show that came out. I've only watched part of it, in full disclosure, but about the gut and like the
Mm,
bacteria and the bio sort of system that governs everything about like our existence.
yes.
And they were looking at I think 4 different people who have different issues,
Mm,
different digestive issues, and they were sort of checking what strains of a bacteria live in their gut. And there
yeah.
was, for example, a lady who was sort of significantly overweight in the States, and she really struggles to lose weight. And she was told, well, you actually don't have any of this, like you have no strains of bacteria that we know correspond to people being able to maintain a healthy weight.
No.
And that comes from the lack of variety of food that
Yeah.
is available. And like basically, if you're not exposed to all those different varieties of food, your biome is deficient.
Yes.
And
Yes. Well, there's a
so that's
uniformity
really
of,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, there's a uniformity of wheat, and wheat again is something else which gets put into everything to thicken things that you would not even think, you know. And if you have to have a gluten
Products
free,
derived from wheat as well. It's not just flour,
yes,
because
no,
when
no,
people
no,
say
yeah,
wheat, they think, oh, you just take grain and you just mill it and it becomes flour.
mm,
But it's like, but there's all those different pure starch products that are being
yes,
derived from things that are on their own not unhealthy.
yes,
And
yes.
yeah.
I think also something else which I notice it from an anthropological perspective, the idea that food is a means and a tool to be together with other people, in origin, this is its function, but that's happening less and less. So often we're just eating on our own, or we eat now and we layer activities because we don't have that much time. So we might eat and watch TV and be on our phones, and we're multitasking as we're eating. This is not, the best thing when it comes to digestion or the way that you consume. You're obviously going to overconsume, but this is something that's taking us in a dangerous direction as well. So it's not just what we eat, it's how we eat it, and the idea, behind food. And a famous anthropologist called Sidney Mintz already in the 80s was talking about this.
But it's really interesting actually when we think about like history of how we approach food. And I think that, for majority of human history, only the very rich or very privileged people who, lived in a particularly bountiful areas had the
Mm,
luxury of thinking of food in terms of pleasure. I
mm,
think, like, for most of human history, it was a question of, scarcity versus abundance, right? Like, how do you get all your nutrients? So that's why we have evolved in the way we have to like try and maintain the energy, trying to, like most species on the planet. operate on a
Yeah.
similar sort of energy conservation sort of system.
Yes.
So, you know, it's been such a short time in history that, at least in the Western world, in majority of Western world, food scarcity has become so much less of an issue. It's still an issue for because, you know, wherever you have sort of wealth inequalities for what you do here. But I think, like, compared to like historically, it's that difference is really striking, isn't it?
Very striking. Yes, I agree with you. I think it's you know, also when it comes to food scarcity, the case of Cuba, which is what I focused on for my PhD, is particularly harrowing because, you know, they still have an embargo. It's, you know, the only place that has had such a long embargo, and things are not changing really. So it's something to think about, that we might live in what we consider to be quite a modern world, but there are some things that remain as they are from, you know, the 60s, the 50s. Yeah.
It's the kind of artificial hunger. I mean, that is something that we see, you know, being done in many different areas of the world at the moment, where limiting people's food becomes a weapon.
A weapon, it's food weaponization, and what you get there is then the flourishing of a black market, where again you have the discrepancy of, you know, who has more money can afford to buy on the black market and who doesn't. So this kind of hierarchy will take place everywhere, and it's I find it, and I think that's why I focused on food, because, you know, these things can happen in different ways. So with the production of different types of products, but I think when it comes to food, I find it hard to digest, because I think that it's a basic human right. So it's very hard to see certain things. And I think that anxiety in general has trickled down to films, to literature in some way or another, which is why I chose to focus on that particularly.
Yeah, I found that there was a passage I particularly loved in there's a moth flying across the screen right
I can
now.
see
I don't know if
it.
you can see
It's very
it.
Gothic, Gabrielle.
Yeah, very Gothic. Yeah, can't catch it. It's so there's a particular quote I really liked that I'm going to read out now. These stories are cakes smothered in frosting and topped with sugared bits. See it cut into them, and there's a hint of mold. Often it's the food that features in these stories, whether devoured by characters or left untouched on their plates, that gives the game away. Much of the food in Gothic tales is there to highlight what isn't there, revealing lack of absence of substance and absence of nourishment, or avoid where domesticity otherwise lived out a snug, cozy, contented life. Like I really like this. There were a couple of bits that for some reason got cut out when I was copying and pasting the text. I don't know if you noticed when I stumbled. But I really like this quote about like how the food is used in those Gothic novels that you used as an example in your book, about like, you know, a food that seems very rich, but there's like an absence of nourishment. Like, what's that literary power of food to you, and like, how did you stumble upon it in literature?
Yes, I think that that's a nice quote, because it really conveys, I think, the whole essence of what we were trying to do with this book, which is provide the image of food in a way that provide an image of food that shows that yes, food is there and it can look nice and it can be very rich, but actually that can also mean something which is quite opposite to that, as in it can highlight things that aren't there. It can highlight the negative. It can highlight things which have gone wrong and that are trying to be covered up by the different layers and the different types of icing that we might use. And it might temporarily do the job, but then, you know, there's still an emptiness there. I think food sends us those signals, and it's very nice how food does that in a subtle way. I do think that a few of the, actually I know because I spoke to Susan Hill, who is the author of The Woman in Black, and I was sending her a message asking about, she mentions apple pie in her book, and I said, can you tell me a bit more about why you chose that particular dessert? And she says, I don't remember doing that at all. She said to me, I don't know why I did it, and I don't even remember that there was an apple pie in the book. And that to me, and that's not the first time that an author that I've asked. Also, when I asked, there's another author called Sarah Waters, and she wrote The Little Stranger, Fingersmith, Paying Guests, all these, but The Night Watch, modern Gothic author. And also I had the opportunity to speak to her and ask her about her use of food. And she said, I've just never thought about it, actually. I don't know. I can't even tell you a thing that I've put. And there is lots of food. To
So
me,
it's like
that
a
was
subconscious sort of. That's really
totally
interesting. Yeah.
so. Not only is the food sending us a signal within the text, it sends me a signal of the time of the author, what the author thinks about the food in their time. Apple pie is a comforting food. And before Arthur Kickling goes off into that horrible house, that's a nice time for him to enjoy life. And we get that with the idea of apple pie. He's not eating something else that is perhaps cold or unwelcoming. He gets that afterwards. So, but the fact that they don't remember, to me, is too interesting.
It's
I
really
love that.
interesting.
It's
I mean, I like include a lot about food in my books. Just like it's such a signifier. It's a very I mean, for me, it's just food. Maybe it's because food is just very important to me, but I find that it's such a huge signifier of the social context of relationships within a community, within a household, even it can be either like this unifying force, like everybody gets a slice of the special thing that we have, or it can be a signifier of the difference in status, who gets the best bit. So I think it's such a fascinating, complex sort of subject, and
you might build your characters around what they eat or what they don't eat. They might have an intolerance, and that might show something about them. You might show a character that always does the food shopping and is unhappy about that, and so that has a particular significance because perhaps that character is a woman and she feels oppressed within the limits of the household, and you show that through food. It's not just for the positive. I think the whole point is that I'm trying to make is that food can be also extremely negative, and that those negative associations that we make go back to a time that we might not understand entirely. So, and it has to do with this separation between sites of production and how we consume food in now, here and now. We don't make food look, it's difficult to grow your own vegetables and fruit and do all that.
Absolutely, yeah.
We are dependent on others. We are dependent on big supermarkets. We don't get a choice of how many different brands we can pick from. And if you don't like the look of something, you don't, everything is, there's a uniformity and I think this creates a lack of control. And then we're being told that, we're not making the right choices, that we're not being held, that we are obese and all of this. And so this all together, I think from the first inklings of that after after the Industrial Revolution, and with those first Gothic texts that are born from that, we get to where we are now, where that's intensified even more, and that we get that even more in the modern Gothic.
I feel like it's interesting in terms of the perception, like something you touched on here, is that it's almost like humanity in the West, at least, has gone like a full circle from obsessing over being how do I get the right nutrients into my body? Like, how do I get like the maximum energy and everything my body needs so I don't die into my body?
Yeah.
And then we've gone into this kind of, oh, wow, like we can overindulge almost, like we can just this abundance, and without thinking about who produced this food, like what is in this food. And I think there's definitely this curve from the kind of in the States, sort of from the 50s almost, but here too, it's just basically like where food became industrialized.
Yes.
And there's this excitement of this overabundance of food. And now we're back full circle to the, okay, stop thinking about food almost as a like thing to enjoy. Think about, how do I calculate what my body needs? You know, in terms of like, how do I get the right amount of like carbohydrates, like the macros, the, you know, it's like, and you know, you have all those apps that will calculate. You just sort of you put in like, I had like this piece of chicken, and then I had like, you know, this much broccoli, and it calculates for you like how much,
How much
you know,
fiber?
in terms of fiber and carbs and protein. Oh, I need to hit this target of protein, you know. So we've gone back to this kind of like not thinking about food in its social context as much, but like thinking about it in terms of, how do I not let those big corporations like poison me, and how do I get real
Yes.
food?
Well, we're defending ourselves, and also we don't have that much time. That's why we have to just get on with it. And this type of messaging, you know, get your 5 a day, all these things are there to make things a little bit easier for us, because we are living the kind of lifestyles that we do. We don't have the time to investigate too thoroughly. And I think that's the issue as well. You know, obviously
Yeah.
there are people who can and do, and you know, that's great. I'm just saying more generally.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's over also like, you know, in terms of simplifying messages, very like messaging around food is like, it's important in terms of trying to get the message to be easy for people to
Yes.
digest.
Digest.
Pardon, pardon the
Yes.
expression. But also not oversimplify, because then the
No.
corporations can use the oversimplification, and you will see on a, you know, bottle of juice, which is stripped of all the fiber, you know, which is stripped of like a lot of the, you know, stuff that is really good for us, and says, well, you know, a glass of this counts as your one a day, you know,
Yeah.
one out of 5 a day. And then you think, okay, well, if I have 3 glasses, that's, you know, 3 of my 5 a day gone, and you're not actually getting all the stuff that you need. So, you know, messaging can be used, you know, can be twisted around and sort of used against you as well.
Absolutely. And I think with the delivery services that we have now, that adds an extra layer of temptation, because you can order something and it won't take long to reach your doorstep. You know, all those donuts, all that pizza is going to be very easily accessible, before maybe, you know, you have to go out and find a place and eat it with, you know,
and
whatever.
interact with people, and actually,
Interact.
you
Now
know,
you
yeah.
don't have to.
Exactly. Going back to the kind of literary sort of dimension of it, and the sort of a language of food. Some things you were saying about in terms of how our perception of food changes, and, you know, the importance we put on food. I think there's also like the secret language of food. There's like an added dimension, like just, you know, to give a Polish example. So in like old sort of Polish Republic, like, and we're talking like 300 years ago, right? There was a tradition in Poland that if a suitor came to court a woman in her father's house, if he was given certain foods, that meant a rejection of suit. So, for example, a suitor who was given either like watermelon or pumpkin or
Interesting.
goose in gray sauce, knew instantly he was rejected.
Really? So,
Whereas if he, you know, he would bring a bottle of drink with him as a gift, if the host shared it with him, that means that the suit was accepted. So it's all those, but, you know, obviously, if you were reading a book, you know, from the 19th century, for example, right, like 19th century Poland, and you read about like, oh, and the suitor was, you know, given pumpkin, you know, and then it's glossed over, you would have missed that context. And I'm wondering how much of that old secret language is lost. And when you were analyzing those books, did you have that in mind about what are we not getting in the context?
yes. And there have been anthropological studies on which is my side of kind of the research, is on, for example, Levi Strauss talks about the culinary triangle. So you get certain foods which reinforce bonds. Traditionally, things like broth, soups, you wouldn't offer someone that you don't feel kindness towards a soup, because it's just something that you have with your family mainly.
Is that like Anglo-centric context, or is it like wider?
No, actually, no, because I think it's valid kind of in a general way, but obviously Levi Strauss was analyzing, you know, populations that were using this as not as a message amongst themselves, just as a general kind of form of, if you're hospitable and if you're having people in your within the four walls of, or whatever that boundary may be, what would you do if you wanted to invite a guest and you didn't know them that well? You would probably roast something. You would probably use fire. It's a more communal experience in the sense of not being so close. And that's something that's just on an anthropological level is something which is talked about in a widespread way. But that's reminding me, because what you're saying about telling a suitor that they're not welcome, and you don't even have to say the words, it's just something that you're indicating.
There's actually a soup on that list of things when you as well, like that you
don't want.
Yeah, there's a particular soup as well that you don't want.
So what can I ask what the ingredients is? Because
I think I might be getting it wrong, honestly. It's because it's called, I just know the name Chernina, and I think it's to do with like duck blood. It's like
it's not just any old soup. It's like the
no,
blood.
there's a particular soup. I'm saying there's a particular soup that you don't want.
No, that's
and the goose in gray sauce specifically, that means a no.
That's so interesting, because also pumpkin. Yeah, I mean, the symbology of certain things. Then we go into the specifics, what it means for each population or country or community even. But in this case, just on very general, broad terms, Levi Strauss was talking about this culinary triangle and and the different types of methodology of cooking and what that would mean generally. So I like this idea that you would make a broth, and that would be for more family purposes, and then you would have a barbecue, and that's for friends and people that maybe you invite, that you perhaps acquaintances that you don't know as well.
In Poland and a lot of Slavic countries, it's bread that you sort of share, and that's something that you would welcome people with bread. And it's a conversation actually I had with Becky Hadid, who does the Storied Recipe podcast. Really recommend it. And we had a conversation about how different countries' sort of folklore represents their value system differently, and the value of hospitality is, especially around food, is really not the same in different countries. And so exactly. So in like, you know, in Slavic countries, if you give someone bread, that's like an unbreakable bond. Like, you're the host, they're your guest, like you protect them now, right? Like you protect them as long as they stay in your house, they're under your protection. Whereas in Norse sort of mythology and Norse folklore, it's very apparent that was not, that this hospitality bond was not unbreakable at all. And it was, and people would kind of, at least in the sort of Eddas and stuff, would regularly come and visit someone, and then they would start killing each other during a feast.
You've got to get rid of the cutlery.
That's a lovely way to put it, yes. So it's like those non-universal things that I think might be lost, you know, when you're so can you give us like an example of like something that you feel people might not pick up on immediately unless they have a PhD in food history?
I don't know. I think that for example, in The Woman in White, I go back to this very devilish figure called Count Fosco, and he's eating a fruit tart, and it's got berries. And I think berries are quite closely connected to the imagery of the devil, because, you know, if the devil is, you want to prevent the devil from coming into your home, you can put blackberries. So the devil can't come in unless he's counted every single piece of blackberry, and that delays the entry of the devil. This is obviously a folk story, but the idea that then that might have in some way influenced the choice of the food that the author might choose to depict a character is very interesting to me. It's that kind of thing that kind of analysis, you know, going back to what you were saying about religion as well. That religion was so pervasive at that time, a lot less than it is now. So when we talk about the devil and devilish figures, you know, that's something that has quite a lot of influence over perhaps the writers in, I don't know, the 18th, 19th century, as opposed to now.
It's interesting when you mention sort of the devil and the berries. Like, I know that in Poland until quite late, until like the 19th century, root vegetables specifically were supposedly only the food for the very poor, really, because it was like carrots, right? Because they were considered to be too close to the devil, because they were in a kind of in folk culture. Because they were considered, you know, it grows in the ground, it's dirty, so it's kind of close to the devil.
Yes.
So obviously it was not a very culturally uniform place.
And
Eastern Europe, but that's something I've read.
And also this idea of the devil in food and like the abundance of food. You know, often you see films which are about religion where there's a lot of fasting and there's a lot of, you know, if you are a saint or if you are really, really good, then you don't need that much food. You're sustained by your faith, really. But actually, in reality, we also see the amount of food that they were having in monasteries and to the priests, and then, you know, also monasteries were a great site of production of food and sweets, etc.
I mean, mortification of body is really interesting in terms of in the context of how food is represented. I think it's definitely a tool of control, and it's still very much a tool of control within like all kinds of different religious cults. And it's something that you seem to focus on quite a bit in your book, when you mention the sort of things either being cruel or kind in the context of the food consumed by the characters. So you mentioned like Frankenstein's monster being a vegetarian, for example, as an example of like this contrast of this unexpected kindness, which is an interesting thing to have written at that time in a culture that was very much meat-eating culture.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people often don't think about that kind of vegetarian aspect of the monster. The fact that the monster was trying to prove that he was worthy of living on this earth and existing within a community of humans. And the way that it proved it was by not consuming meat. So there was this association between meat and violence then. And obviously this has a lot to do with the time that Shelley was writing in. But yes, it's you know, it's unexpected, and it's not something that you would think of, but it gives it a special kind of tenderness, and maybe you have some sympathy for the monster, and there's a further layer there of understanding of something that you wouldn't have if you didn't have that association to vegetarian. When I say vegetarian, it's also scarcity, because the monster is it's a big thing and it needs sustenance, and it could kill a lamb, it could kill a goat, it could kill a pig, whatever, you know, but it's choosing to eat berries. So it's a very clear signal that it's willing to make a sacrifice in order to be accepted, and no one's going to accept it. So it's quite a moving moment for me.
It's beautiful. I haven't actually, I remember studying it at university, but I had never made that connection, and it's a very poignant one. I think in like many books of that time, like you see when you think about people like not eating or enough, it's more about others exerting control over them, like in Oliver Twist and sort of Jane Eyre. And you sort of focus. I literally sort of talk about it a bit more because I think it's just such a powerful way to control the emotions of the reader as well.
Yes, because also, similarly to Frankenstein's monster, although it's big and it's a monster, it is childlike. And that's the same thing that we have in things like Oliver Twist or Jane Eyre. They are children. So that's an extra arrow to the heart, isn't it? Because it's one thing to suffer as an adult, but when you know that it's a child, that might touch a different kind of heartstring. And especially in Jane Eyre, with all the trials and tribulations that she goes through, you get that real sense of kind of hunger. And at some point, she doesn't even want to engage with food. She's just, but certainly not begging for food. I think there's also this sense of being dignified and understanding that it's nearly as if maybe she doesn't have a right to food the way that she's been brought up, compared to her rich aunt and uncle and her greedy cousin, who doesn't meet a good end, by the way, as most greedy characters don't. But she is very strong, and I think that strength is directly connected to her how she can resist the temptation of food. So I think that's something that's that we touched upon quite clearly. And there are lots of scenes where there is food involved, and a bit like Roald Dahl and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where he has again a sense of hunger and scarcity, but when he does get the chocolate bar, he's eating a tiny bit, a corner is enough. And think of how, I don't know, adverts show us eating now, just throwing things down our throat. Just the depiction of it, not us. But when you get these that show that it's just a little bit, just the taste of it, just the shadow of a piece of cake is enough for Jane. And and I like that. And I never really thought of it as a traditional Gothic text, but it very much is when it comes to food. I think the idea of resisting temptation, and then again we have that religious aspect a lot in the book. That's very interesting in a few chapters. And then what food tells us about her love with Mr. Rochester, if it is love, and other things. A lot of food and a lot of signals there in that book, which I really enjoyed.
And how did you can you talk a little bit about, because obviously it's not just with your book isn't just an analysis of, I mean, I say just as if it wasn't a gargantuan task that you just accomplished, but it's not just a literary analysis of food and text. You have actually created a collection of recipes that are inspired by the books. So how did you sort of decide with your co-author on?
Yes, because I said to Ella, this is how it all started. It was my birthday and I got a beautiful book in the post, and it was actually this book here, and it was Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allan Poe. Look how big.
And I love Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, and my friend also it's illustrated beautifully. Anyway, I was just absolutely delighted. I phoned Ella, I said, thank you so much. She said, look, Ali, I was looking actually for a book on the Gothic and food, because that's what you're doing for your PhD and you love the Gothic and food, but there's nothing. And I said, Ella, why don't we do it? And that's how it started. She's a food journalist, also researches into the history of food, a wonderful writer. And we started working on it. And I remember very clearly, one of my I would say something that irritates me quite often is when I say that I do Gothic food, immediately someone jumps to that Halloween-y kind of image of food, brains gushing out of your skull, an eye, dripping and blood.
Yeah, like the Addams Family kind of subversion.
Yes, you're going to do a recipe with maggots. So you're going to, and so I said, Ella, what we do have to do is do a recipe book with recipes inspired by the delicious dishes in ingredients in the Gothic novels, not this idea of disgusting Halloween-y food, which also is good fun, but it's like not, and that doesn't exist. This is the first Gothic cookbook ever. and that has these recipes which are actually will be very wonderful to eat and to make, and that might be a full dish that's mentioned in the book. For example, in Dracula, paprikash is mentioned, and we do a paprikash dish. Other times it might be a few ingredients, and then there is an elaboration on that, which is coming from our side. So it just depends, but everything will be nice to eat as well.
I remember, like, the one that really made an impression on me is the Sad Sunday, but recipe from Heart is a Lonely Hunter,
Yeah.
which is like, I instantly, when Tuva, I even sent a screenshot to my dad because that's his favorite book.
Oh.
And I thought it was just so beautiful because you made like a recipe for one, and it was and I thought it was just such a beautiful metaphor for this book, which is, you know, so much about, like, you know, feeling isolated as well. And
Yeah.
in our current, like, you know, you mentioned it earlier, in a kind of, you know, the way we live now, we're kind of being isolated, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that I think it's not that we're kind of, with the lifestyle that we have, we don't really see many other ways out. I mean, in order to be more communal,
Yeah. I
something.
mean, when I say being isolated, I actually mean it like as an active top-down activity that has been happening over the last several decades, because, you know, we are losing that's something actually I feel very strongly about, that we are losing a third spaces, you know, in anthropology. I'm sure, as you know, there's this concept that we need you know, our home, the place we work, and then we need a third space where we can socialize and we can just be and interact with other people. And those third spaces have been consistently and quite consciously taken away from us. You know, we no longer have communal halls where people meet every Friday or Saturday. You know, libraries are being defunded, libraries are pretty much the only place left in the UK where you can go and do something, just be and not spend money.
Yes. Ali Smith wrote a lovely book about libraries. You know, they are hubs for trouble. They want to stop the rebels.
Yeah, I mean, you know, why should you just exist and not pay money? Like, that's the question that our overlords are asking themselves constantly.
Consumption is an important part also of making money go round. So yes, it's hard to find a place where you go and not spend any money and be together with other people, that's for sure.
Yeah, so yeah, I thought that Sad Sunday was a beautiful example of that. And I think seeing those recipes, I think, also makes people think about food in a slightly different way, and what's available and how we consume it. So I think it's just a very interesting text that you and co-author have created. And I would like people to sort of talk about food and literature in a bit more conscious way as well, because yeah, we're showing also like our biases, or even like the way we don't think about food, like when you mentioned about the authors done.
Yes, of course. Yes, there's a lot that goes on, you know, when things aren't mentioned, you know, so that's also very interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you. On that note, thank you so much for coming in the show, and I really enjoyed our chat, and I wish that we could talk for a whole lot.
I know. This is a good space, you see, and we're not paying any, well, I suppose we are paying.
I'm paying Zoom a little something, but you know, I can live with that.
But thank you for creating this space and conversation. It's really lovely of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.